countries were fighting, right? Fighting to actually become independent countries. We had some of our leaders who were behind bars trying to win elections, right? And I was thinking the other day that, you know, within that, about Kwame Nkrumah, because Ghana was the first country to gain independence. And what his slogan was, but one of the mottos he had was political independence. And he said this. Is that okay? No. So he said this statement, right? With the belief that we gain political independence now, and soon we will be able to have conversations about economic independence. Unbeknownst to him, the rules that govern our international economic governance structure were already being known, right? By the same countries that essentially were pushing back against our want for independence. And so what we have now is a current international financial architecture that, because it was established by the dominant countries then, is swinged in their favor. Essentially has rules that are in place that are going to benefit them. The minute developing countries were able to start engaging with certain discussions around within the international financial architecture, they started to push back, right? And so this was as early as the 1940s, when the Latin American countries started to say, we need to establish an intergovernmental organization. We need to relook at the allocation of tax and rights. But this was pushback, as you can imagine, particularly from the United States and the UK. And so our current system today is based on that background, right? It's based on essentially a background where developing countries are not participating, and every single time they were pushing for reform, received pushback. And so this is what we have been advocating against, and this is what we are really excited to see the African group spearheading within the United Nations. The current global North countries, as you can imagine, are pushing for maintenance of the status quo. When the African group, tabled this resolution that was adopted by consensus, the US immediately tabled another amendment, an amendment to this resolution that was to water down the resolution that had been tabled by the African group. That didn't gain any traction. We were really excited to see that. But at the end of the day, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done, right? In terms of supporting the African group, in terms of now that the Secretary General's report has come out, pushing for an option that actually sees meaningful change in the current architecture that we are presently in. So that's the inclusivity question. The other strand of what the Africa Group Resolution tries to address is the effectiveness question, right? Over the past 3 years, with oversight from the OECD inclusive framework, we have actually seen an increase in dose erosion and profit shifting, right? And so there's a question about, does the system that we have at present work, right? Because what that is resulting in is resources that are leaving many of our countries that we all need, right? To achieve our objectives. The thing about this is often when we talk about this as two general investors, we often talk about the negative effects it has on global South countries. And this is completely true. The issue of tax dodging, of profit shifting, and illicit financial flows has its most negative and detrimental effects on global South countries because it constitutes such a large amount of our GDP, and this is resources that we could be using, right, to put in healthcare, to put in education, to put in other key public services. But at the end of the day, the current system is affecting all countries, not just global South countries, but global North countries. In fact, the numbers, when you're looking at how much is being shifted, I mean, it ranges from between $100 and $500 billion, depending on the estimates. But it also affects, as I mentioned, global North countries. The only countries that benefit from our current system are the taxes, right? And so as a result, it's not just a global South issue. This is an issue that all of us need to come behind to support. So at the end of the day, we see this as a watershed moment. We see this as an opportunity to undo the injustices of the past in a way that benefits, as I mentioned, not only global South countries, but all of us. We see it as important that this conversation be shifted from the OECD to the United Nations because that's where we will have a semblance of democratization of the international financial architecture, where we will have all countries being able to participate in equal footing, not sort of the tiered hierarchy we see at present. But also at the United Nations, we're able to have this tax discussion not as a solitary issue, but because the UN also deals with various social issues, various issues pertaining to inequality, etc.
About tax, to those issues, which is so imperative when you're thinking about the work that you do. So I hope I can go over some of this. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. We're not doing this dance again because I will hand the mic back to Bodo now. But thank you so much. One, thanks, Chennai, for kicking this off. And of course, highlighting what has been a very positive move. Thanks to Africa's leadership and following this.
I think Paul was in the preparation of the SDP summit was one because the hottest negotiating issue, interestingly. This came from the fact that UN, the Secretary General, also many countries, many developing countries tried to push the so-called SDGs stimulus package as one of the major outcomes of the summit. So the idea was that we need that we get the means of implementation, scale up the means of implementation, that we have to get SDG implementation back on track. And for this, we need more money. So then the idea came up that basically through World Bank and IMF, we could mobilize an additional $500 billion per year for SDG implementation. This was a bit of a weird idea to start with because many developing countries are already heavily indebted at the moment, and everything that these IFIs can provide is actually loans, concessional loans. But it was also a bit of a fact of the political situation that the tax agenda is moving forward, but slowly, that the donors are not delivering on their other commitments, and it was basically the second best option to get some fresh money on the table. It received a lot of criticism from our side for these reasons. Interestingly, there was also a lot of criticism from the other side. So the reason why the SDG Summit outcome document couldn't be adopted, I think in June was the idea to adopt it, is because there was a last-minute intervention by a group led by the USA, by USCANs, including the United Kingdom, against some paragraphs in the outcome document, which were talking about the allocation of special drawing rights and about World Bank governance reform. So these were the controversial issues. And this, well, you might want to ask, why is this so controversial? Well, indeed, I mean, because what the UN is attempting to do is at the moment to push a fundamental reform of these international financial institutions, which essentially date back to the time when they've been founded, in the 1940s. Basically, I mean, it's remarkable when you look at old photos from the Bretton Woods conference. They look actually quite funny. I mean, I wanted to put this on the screen, but you have these photos where you see 44 delegations. It's all 44 white men. It's not a single, a little bit darker skinned person, and it's not a single woman present at this conference. And this was the conference that founded IMF and World Bank. So things have changed a little bit then. I mean, in the meantime, they have Woods institutions. At the So we basically still have a situation where basically the rich countries are called director. In the World Bank, but this is actually what we're also trying to achieve when we say we need to move decision-making power to the FFD process. This is a process where at the United Nations, where basically these developed countries, low-income countries can basically make their case heard, represent their case better. On the other hand, the US voting power at the IMF and World Bank is in both cases below 15%, at 16.5% at the IMF, 15.6% at the World Bank, and it's just 0.51% at the United Nations. So here you can see what motivated the US protest against having these issues discussed at the United Nations. And what happened now in the negotiation of the SDG Summit outcome document is that these paragraphs have been modified. The paragraph on economic governance reform has been about, and in fact, what happened is that it the ongoing G7 trying to expand mandate of the World Bank. The existing World Bank mandate is to eradicate poverty and to work on it. agenda that we were pursuing for many decades already. This is, I mean, on the one hand, this is World Bank governance reform, giving more voice and vote to the global South. It's also addressing the so-called private finance first approach. I think you're going to address this first, because the World Bank has this so-called cascade approach that they say when a problem can be addressed with private money, you shouldn't use public money for it, which is extremely harmful when it comes to financing public goods, health service, education services. And we're also trying to get the World Bank to become a little bit more human rights based in all its operations, phasing out fossil fuel funding and so on, being pursued by the G20 reform. And yeah, I mean, that's probably the way to go. I hope actually that we can also, that we can have an intelligent interplay between the process here at the United Nations and at the World Bank, because there are dilemmas, of course, when you discuss World Bank reform at the World Bank, the decision-making powers in a way that you basically, that the major shareholders, the rich countries, need to give in. And this is the dilemma. This is why it was so important to discuss it at the United Nations, where basically the voting rights are distributed in a different way. And this is where we stand. And yeah, I hope we're going to take this forward. I mean, the SDG summit hasn't been very successful in this regard, but of course, I mean, we have basically a summit marathon coming up. I mean, there's the Summit of the Future next year. There's the Financing for Development Conference, hopefully in 2025. So there will be more opportunities to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and warm thanks, Bodo, because yes, all countries are talking about reform. As always, the devil is in the detail. And we continue to be very concerned that we have global North countries pushing very hard for reform that is actually strengthening the status quo and possibly making it worse. So warm thanks, Bodo, for that. Next, we have Jennifer Malonzo with Ebon International, based in the Philippines, who will speak to the ODA architecture as well as the private finance first approach more broadly to development. Jennifer.
Thanks much, Pooja, and good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening, wherever you are in the world today. Let me just start by saying that our understanding of the international financial architecture starts from the realization that, the global South are experiencing so much resource drains. So we are today faced with a multiple crisis, and the deepening crisis of the world is very much impacting, especially on the South, because of the historical extraction that we have suffered. There are some studies, some academics that say that the global North has actually extracted over 152 trillion worth of resources from the global South since the 1960s. And meanwhile, 37 of the world's 46 least developed countries are very much dependent on the export of their primary commodities. So this situation brings us to a dual problem that we face. One is that the issue of our country's resources to facilitate their own development have actually taken away. And second, the condition where powerful actors like the World Bank, discussed earlier by Bodo, have actually driven the narrative of a so-called financing gap, which frames development merely as a question of money and unequal economic relations in the world today. So in the title of our session asks, which financial architecture for economic justice? And so really the question behind this is whose interests are being served under this dominant international financial architecture. So we see that in the bigger picture, this international financing architecture is really serving the world economy that is, capitalistic, oligopolistic, and dominated by corporations and finance capital. while on the other hand, the peoples of the global south are toiling in so much exploitation, no? Suffering plunder of their resources, poverty wages, precarious work, and also underpaid care work, especially for women. So this backdrop shows that we cannot really talk about financial flows such as aid, and which is a public resource, and private finance outside of this whole context, no, that we are in. Speaking of the aid system, the value of aid, of development cooperation, is actually because ODA flows is supposed to address poverty and inequalities. That is the original mandate. However, over the years, this mandate has been eroded, and there is so much deviation from this original mandate, which highlights also key issues of quality as well as quantity. So as you know, there is the basic call, since maybe 3 decades or 4 decades ago, of having a 0.7% of GNI as ODA. That is the commitment of developed countries for southern countries. But the terrible reality is that these are unfinished and unfulfilled promises. And then second, there is also the age-old practice of advancing their own economic and geopolitical interests for the OECD DAC countries, and been more about catalyzing private financing. The discourse also on aid architecture has shown that it is very much by geopolitical considerations and a continuing discourse on neocolonialism. As earlier also discussed by Chennai, you cannot divorce the origins of ODA, that it was coming from a colonial history, of being also in the context of decolonization decades ago, but now is also being used to further the foreign policy of the powers that be in our world today. And then third issue that arises from this is that all these rhetorical questions and commitments on the aid has also never really allowed that we have something binding. It has always been voluntary on the part of the OECD DAC, the donor countries. So years ago, we have called for a binding convention on development cooperation, and that has never really come to fruition because northern states don't want to be held accountable for their aid commitments and to fulfill their the mandate of anti-poverty. Another aspect that I'd like to look into, as mentioned by Bodo earlier, how the dominance of the private finance first is really also creeping into the discourse on development aid. So colleagues have also pointed out that there is really a strong push and a strong tactic not to justify that private finance is a primary source of financing for sustainable development. However, this rests on the false premise that, as I mentioned earlier, that money is not enough. So there's that discourse about trillions held by investors and corporations should be unlocked, no, and used for development finance. So our main problem with such discourse is that we are being told to put our faith to bank our own development on the hands of corporation private capital, which the UN studies have actually shown that they have been short short on coming out with development results, and are actually just doing SDG washing, or exaggerating their contributions on the sustainable development, and also continue to finance anti-development projects and practices such as practices such as supporting fossil fuels and putting us at risk at every turn. So I have just one. So this is also highlighted by what the World Bank calls the cascade approach. They put private capital as the primary source first, for development, and advising countries to rely on private capital instead of turning to public funding for development solutions. That is very problematic. Besides being at the mercy of the profit interest and the impacts of private capital on our economies. So what do we exactly call for? We need economic justice. In general, we think that the fight is actually about the narrative. There is a narrative fight here that the framing on financing gap needs to be also counterposed with the basic premise I've mentioned earlier about losses and drains on the global South economies, and also the problem with the current international financial architecture and the whole economic system. So this means that there is really a necessity to shift the international financial architecture away from the stranglehold of corporations and private capital. It means we break from the colonial patterns of investment. We rebuild our own domestic economies so that it economies for our own people's needs, for the domestic needs. And also it means having ecological transitions that allow the South to not repeat the whole pattern of the Western industrialization, as well as our own people, our countries, our own workers, peasantry, indigenous people, women, youth, etc., being able to determine their own development paths. So in conclusion, the shifts in international financial architecture that we need today, one, we have to work on having a binding convention on development cooperation under the auspices of the UN, of course, so that the northern countries, the donors, are held accountable to their decades-old promise that is still unfulfilled on ODA. There's also a strong need for the regulation of private finance. And there is the at the table now the UN binding treaty on TNCs, so which is really a good move, but of course it's taking years, no, because of all the opposition and the lack of will, no, political will of countries to push for this binding treaty. And then, of course, in any policy development, in any policy decision making, we would like to highlight that, you know, development should primarily be about public finance. And the private finance should be secondary and should just serve that primary role of public finance. And we really need to, you know, raise our voices against the private finance approaches that are being promoted by the World Bank, and instead look more into their historical responsibility for the our state today, how we have come to these multiple crises that we are currently facing, and all the impacts that the southern economies are suffering. So I think that I would end there. Thank you, Puja, and thanks. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that very comprehensive. I know this is, and there's time to so much to say, but very warm thanks, especially for the clear call, the fact that we need a binding convention on development cooperation and to really hold global North countries accountable for their historical commitments. We now move on to the next speaker, which is Jason Braganza of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AFRODED. I think many of you heard him speak this morning. So welcome, Jason, and I hand it over to you.
Okay, amazing. Thank you, Puja, and also thanks to Boro, Chennai, and Jennifer for setting a very good platform for me to speak. So I'm going to talk specifically about the issue of public debt and how that intersects with the question that has been asked: what kind of international financial architecture we're looking for. To set the scene, it's important for us to begin to ask certain questions about the idea of debt as a financial instrument. We need to ask, how does debt finance intersect or interact with other forms of finance, whether it's ODA, whether it's public-private partnerships, whether it's tax. Important for us to know what are those intersections and what are those interconnectedness that makes it so easy for those who are advising our governments, but also our own governments, to say, yes, we're happy to take on this debt, and we think it's okay because, you know, we have the relevant instruments or the relevant frameworks to protect our economies and protect our citizens from any type of crisis or challenges that we might face. But more importantly, it is also important to understand, how does debt as an instrument of finance intersect with the most important part of what Chennai mentioned with regard to financing, and that is revenue mobilization. To what extent is debt linked to production and to productive capacities within our economies and within our jurisdictions? And in that vein, to what extent then does debt lead to transformative processes or the transformation of our economies from low-value, commodity-dependent economies to high-value, manufacturing and exportation of finished goods that are high value in nature and contribute towards the raising of domestic revenues and tax revenues in particular. But then we also need to ask ourselves, in that same vein, to what extent is the debt then also not a destabilizing factor when it comes to uncertainty and crisis? And again, this is a question that has not been interrogated enough within the governance structure of issues of public debt, particularly when you look at the currency denomination on which public debt is currently held, In the morning, I had wanted to use the example or the commonly held phrase when a butterfly flaps its wings somewhere in South America. There's usually a mega earthquake or tsunami happening across the world. And if you can think of debt in that sense that is not denominated in domestic currency, and think of US dollar debt in particular when there's a fluctuation in exchange rates or interest rates, that's exactly what is happening in countries of the global north, in the global south. On our continent in Africa, that's exactly what happened earlier this year when the Fed decided to raise interest rates. All of a sudden, the cost of debt skyrocketed, and a lot of national currencies were thrown into disarray with domestic currencies losing their value instantly with the stroke of one decision being made in the US. So it's very important to connect the dots when people use the phrase, debt is not necessarily a bad thing. The inability for us to link that, or link public debt and a debt finance instrument in that sense is very important. It's also important to realize that debt has many faces, right? There is multilateral debt, there's commercial and private debt, and there's bilateral debt in particular. And each of these have different forces that are acting for different interests. Excuse me. And most prevalently, the interests that are being worked for is the holder of the debt, not the borrower, it's the lender. And this is very fundamental when you think of then how does the international financial architecture govern public debt and the interaction between borrower and lender. So the design is that shareholders or the holders of debt are the ones that must benefit. They are the ones whose interests are being put first, instead of those who are the borrowers or the people who are actually paying the debt through tax policies and taxation. And I think this is what Bordeaux's image, of the Bretton Woods institutions tries to illustrate in that sense. So when we're talking then about borrowing our way out of debt, what does that actually mean? There is a complete disconnect in the governance of public debt in terms of solving crises. There has been a lazy attempt by policymakers to advance this idea that the only way to solve the debt crisis, or the current debt crisis, is to continue borrowing your way out of debt. And how do they do this? They give you just enough to get your credit rating stable, so that it gives signals or provides signals to the international system that your economy or the health of your economy is doing just enough well for you to continue receiving this drip short-term lending from the Bretton Woods institutions. Secondly, what this has done is it has reaffirmed in one way or another the role of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in global finance architecture, the governance when it comes to issues of public debt, and the role of the credit rating agencies in supplementing the role of the IMF and the World Bank in this regard. And this is something we at Afrodad, and together with our comrades at the FCSO FFD mechanism, are trying to debunk and to challenge and to say that this is the wrong approach, because what is currently happening is that we're giving institutions that have very little democratic space, very little room for space and voice from developing countries and countries of the global south to actually make decisions about how they use their finance. And so we need to be able to declutter that noise and bring that noise or bring that space into an area or into a process where global south voices are actually heard and have the opportunity to put that voice, and that is within the United Nations. Borrowing a leaf from our friends and comrades in the tax space, there is a huge opportunity now, given that every form of finance or every type of finance instrument that is supposed to solve every crisis in the world is some form of debt instrument or some sort of debt finance. There needs to be a body, there needs to be a system and process where global south countries, because they are the largest recipients of debt finance or the takers of debt finance, needs to have a space where they have an equal voice or just a more powerful voice in how this debt finance or debt architecture is being governed. And so we need to empower that process. We need to take a leaf and empower our global south groupings, particularly in the United Nations process, to push this agenda forward within the United Nations. There have been proposals, for example, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, are now talking about debt authority, how that might look or what description that might take. is yet to be seen, but it is the right step in taking away power from institutions that do not have the world's interests at heart, into a process and into a space where, you know, the world's interests can be an important and at the center. I think, you know, this morning, one of the UN representatives talked about the first sentence, we the people. And I think that is what the debt discussion needs to embrace, and the CSO movement needs to embrace in bringing that, because the debt payment is done by we the people. It's not done by government. It's not done by multinational corporations. It's done by we the people through the taxation and to the taxes that we pay. And lastly, in terms of what kind of financial architecture we want, is we need to disrupt this idea of country groupings like the G20 and the G7. They do not work in anyone's interests. We at AFRODAN, particularly on the African continent, are grappling with the decision that was taken just a few weeks ago by the G20 to admit the African Union into the G20. We have no idea how this is going to play out. We are terribly concerned that there's going to be a lot of horse trading between what happens in the G20 and what we can expect to happen in a democratic process such as that under the United Nations. And so there's a lot of strategizing that we need to do to ensure that, you know, groupings like the G20 are not used as instruments and agencies of disrupting the very important role that it does in terms of divide and conquer when it comes to the global economic governance, particularly in a reformed and a different type of financial architecture, especially when it comes to debt, given that this seems to be the direction that every institution is proposing. And lastly, very, very lastly, we need to ensure that we do say no to this overburdened reliance on debt as a financial instrument. The role of using market-based approaches that continue to generate debt as a solution to public problems. This is not going to work. It is not sustainable, and it's going to actually shorten the window of which debt crisis continues to occur, given that we do live in a very volatile world at this current moment in time. So that's what we need to do. That is the context within which we are working in the debt environment, and what we would like to see moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that very helpful overview. Last but not the least, we have Jane Nalunga with the Southern Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiation Institute, CIPD Uganda, and she will speak to issues around the trade architecture. And of course, trade is a very important pillar of the Financing for Development agenda. I know we can do a 1.5-hour discussion on just this, but it's also very complicated politically to talk about trade and development in the United Nations because of course, the political economy and challenges around the WTO. And so how do we really, how do we bring some of these aspects of the trade and development agenda to the United Nations? Helping us understand all of this is Jane. So Jane, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pooja. And good afternoon, comrades who are here and who are online. As I have been introduced, I'm Jane Nalunga. I work for an organization called CIATIN, Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. We work in Eastern and Southern Africa on trade and trade-related issues. And maybe to talk about trade-related, when we talk about trade, when you add on trade-related, it means everything is trade. Services, we talk about health, education, food, everything has been put in the marketplace to be haggled over, to be negotiated, and to be taken by the highest bidder. And those are the multinationals. So when we talk about trade, it's really powerful. And I just wanted to add on, continue from where Jason ended, that we need to say no to debt. How do we say no to debt? Because if we are to be self-sufficient, to be able to grow, to finance our development. We need an income as countries, and we have to get it from trade. So we need to trade. And for me, I think trade is central in achieving the SDGs and also in addressing all these crises we are having. However, if we are to use trade as a tool to get out of poverty, the rules have to change. You know, it's interesting that when you look at what we have been discussing here, from finance to aid to debt, now to trade, we are saying we need reforms. We need things have to change. And I think the whole issue around the global governance is very important. There is a very high democratic deficit in the global governance when it comes to all these issues, debt, trade, finance, everything it has to change. And it's also interesting what Bodo showed us about the old men, because we are not there. Our countries were not there. When you look at the history of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, most of our countries joined because we were colonies of other developed countries. That's how we came to be part of that GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which came into, which evolved into the WTO. So we are not there. We didn't ask to be there. We just found ourselves there. So the rules have to change. In the WTO, again, the issue of reforming the WTO is on the table. Reform the entire multilateral trading system. But maybe a caution, I'm just coming from UNGA. There was a policy forum, the WTO policy forum, and this forum was about climate change and how trade can contribute to more greener and more sustainable future. That link between trade and climate change. And these are some of the reforms they have been talking about, bringing the climate change into the WTO. In a way, it's okay, but in a way, we need to be aware that when we talk about reform, we are looking at it from different ways. In the WTO, the reform, because there is the Africa group there in the WTO, they put on paper so many issues to reform the WTO. And one of them was to address the imbalances within the multilateral trading system. Imbalances which give protection, for example, to developed country agriculture and not to the poor countries. You know, those imbalances are there. And the Africa group is saying, let us go back, look at those imbalances, so that the multilateral trading system can work for the poor, so that there is special and differential treatment for the poor countries. But the other group, when it talks about the reforms, they are looking at bringing more issues on the table. For example, when it comes to climate change, they want to bring government procurement in the WTO. This is just an example. Government procurement is very, very critical for countries to be able to direct where money goes, because government is the biggest procurer in infrastructure. You can be able to grow your private sector by saying this infrastructure, that road, that railway will be constructed by the local company, not by an international company. Now they want to change that, saying that government procurement has to be transparent, inclusive. You have to be. You can't expect a multinational company to be able, you can't expect a national company to be able to compete with a multinational company. But they are bringing government procurement in the WTO because of climate change, that you can be able, government will be able to procure green technologies and green products. So when we talk about reform, we need to be clear what kind of reform we want, the reforms which are going to work for the people. Moving forward, I think it's important for us, because when we talk about reforms, we need also to look at the reforms at our respective national and regional levels. Because I listened when Jason, when we were in his opening remarks around the neoliberal policies around privatization, opening up, liberalize your economy. And we did this, we liberalized our economies under the IMF World Bank conditionalities. We've opened up. And what happened? Our industries couldn't withstand the competition. They collapsed. But we are still following in the same trend. In the WTO, they are telling us more liberalization will help you. It will help you to bring in technology, green technology, continue opening up. But also in our policies at national and regional levels, we are opening up. For example, Africa will have a continental free trade area. And the issue on the table is liberalize, remove tariffs without looking at increasing our productive capacities. So when we talk about reforms, we need to be able to see what kind of reforms can we be able to do at our respective national and regional level. An example of investment policies, our investment policies, all of them, we tell that investor come in, do what you want, take out what you want. And on top of that, we give them incentives that we sit here and talk about financial flows, that the money is going out. Yet, in our investment agreements, all our countries, we tell them, come do what you want, take out whatever you want. So we need to rethink those policies. We also need to look at the linkages, and I'm so happy when you look at, the way we are looking at issues here, issues of debt, trade, finance, aid, what do we do with our IMF World Bank? Those linkages are very, very important. And those linkages have to be mainstreamed in our policies and strategies, so that it's, because for me, when I look at what's happening here, it's we are fighting a war, but we have different battlefronts. But we need to be coordinated to win the war. Lastly, when you look at the SDGs, MDGs and SDGs, those of you who remember the MDGs, MDG 8 was about global partnerships. SDG 17 is about, again, global partnerships. And that's where the crux of the matter is. There is no global partnership. We do come here in the UN and agree on the SDGs, and we are talking with one voice. All of us, SDGs, will have to address them. You go to OECD, you go to the WTO, different, we are different. It's like we are fighting a losing battle. We tell them we want to protect our agriculture, we want to protect our food security. We say no, open up. So that we need to ensure that when we talk about global partnerships, they are real global partnerships. And I think we need to hold the developed countries accountable on SDG, SDG 17 and the earlier MDG 8. Because unless we have that global partnership, we won't be able to address the poverty, the poly crisis, the climate crisis. One issue which came up clearly when we were in Geneva, when we are looking at the climate change, it's the issue of the unilateral initiatives which are coming up today, in the guise of addressing climate change. The EU has put in place the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So there are issues which are being put on the table to address climate change, but they are going to hurt developing countries. CBAM is a tax, but it's unilateral. We haven't discussed it, but it's going to limit the way we trade with the European Union. So again, these are issues of partnership. So lastly, when we are talking about trade, I think it's important that we look at the linkages, the linkages between trade, debt, climate change, finance, so that we can be able to have holistic agreements and policies.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that very helpful overview. And I think with this, we can open the floor for any questions from anyone in the audience. I see one hand there. Maybe we can do a round of questions.
All comments. Only questions. They're the only ones who know anything.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Stephen. I'm from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, based in Manila. I was just wondering, because a lot of the things that you mentioned, we would have our eyes towards the FFT conference. But currently, there's also this very interesting process that I don't know. Could be a distraction, could be something that would push our agenda even more. And that would be the negotiation on the right to development, which also covers a lot of the structural issues, trade, debt, investments, etc., etc. So the process that I know so far has already concluded in Geneva and will now shift to New York. So I'm not sure, maybe Barbara also has some of her thoughts on that. Would this be something that we should also be investing our energies and, focus on? So, yeah.
Thanks so much. We're talking about reframing the narrative, and I was struggling, first of all, with the session and how it's framed. I was wondering whether we should be asking ourselves which financial architecture or which economic architecture, just looking at the issues that have been discussed here. I just want to speak about the forces that are also trying to define the structural issues that we are trying to address as civil society, especially on IFFs and how there are efforts to redefine actually IFFs, and how the global north, in particular institutions from the global north, are mobilizing even resources to invest in developing IFF strategy, supporting key institutions to develop an IFF strategy, and then develop a separate extension strategy, and what that then means for our work, and how this is now starting to trickle down into different decisions, different declarations. If you look at, for example, for those from Africa, recently there was the Africa Climate Summit. And when you look at the declaration in that summit, when you read the declaration, it talks about the loss of corporate tax revenues of $27 billion. So you can clearly see the language and how they're trying to redefine IFFs. And in fact, the commitment they make to reduce the 27 billion by 50% by 2030, and then by 75% by 2070. And so by 2050, to reduce by 75%. So you can easily tell whatever we're pushing for, that our leaders are not like, they're either not part of the conversation or are not showing that commitment to actually push through. And that's the only sentence that captures international tax cooperation in that particular declaration. So for me, I find it problematic, and I think that we should start looking at it and also call out institutions that are supporting, are behind this change of narrative and trying to redefine that. And then maybe Gordon, you can speak to this. We're talking about reform of the global international finance, but there are processes, what I'll call like tranquilizers or painkillers. The IMF is currently undergoing the quarter review. They might bring maybe an additional Africa executive director. And then you're told, yeah, we moved a step, and we celebrate that as a group. So how do we approach some of these? How do we deal with some of these painkillers or tranquilizers that come on us? Yeah, I'll stop there. My name is Joab Okanda. I work for the people of Africa through an organization called Christian.
Okay, I will put a question mark to my colleague. No, actually, I don't need to talk about it if you are interested. But I want to, okay, my name is Teresa, I'm from the Global Alliance for Justice. I want to comment on this issue of reforms. Everybody was talking about reforms. From this perspective, if we start to know OECD, they can't tell us why OECD is doing it, why it should be duplicated. The World Bank, they want to reform it. Other way that, Bodo has put it very well, with which intentions are doing it. But if you say member states should go into it and reform it, will be duplication. So this duplication thing, why are we hanging on the issue that the UN should be the one that says the decision making on behalf of member states instead of, but also we cannot make the UN itself free of charge for this, because sometimes we read the UN General Secretary is asking the G20 to do it, the G20 to do that. So in all this sense, what do you think about this issue?
Yeah, Roberto Pinawin from CSR Partnership for Developmental Effectiveness. Listening to the 5 speakers, I'm hit by the fact that it seems like it's the same story across all the narratives, which is a situation where there's what you call as democratic deficit in all the so-called global governance, in all the pillars of development financing, whether it be trade, whether it be debt, whether it be development cooperation, taxation. And yet, these are the same instruments that are supposed to finance this lofty ideal of Agenda 2030, which is a bit of a counterintuitive, because it seems like what is expected to finance it is just undermining the aspiration. So on the other hand, you are also saying, most of you are saying we have to go to, or many of the calls is going back to the UN, or trying to make sure that we have reforms in the same global governance structures. And in my mind, my question is, given the power imbalance in what you have already said, what will it take to make this reform meaningful? Why do we still have faith in this reform?
Yeah, so thank you very much. My name is Mufika. I work with Pan African Climate Office Alliance. And I just can't agree more with my colleagues. So when I listened to the presenters, I think they have a solution to all what we need, very excellent presentations. But then I think we need to acknowledge the shifting geopolitics. And we have not heard anyone speaking about, for instance, the emergence of the BRICS and the way they are shifting the global geopolitical interactions. And perhaps the so-called, when we hear the North, the big powers talking about now we need reforms. What kind of reforms? Is it really to forestall the emergence of the axis like the BRICS, or what is it, the kind of reforms? And reforms can be either positive or negative. So that it can really injure us, it can come as a negative consequence of an oppression. And what you need to look at right now is really the growing power of the right-wing movement, particularly in the North. Look at what is happening in the US, in Europe, in Italy. Look at who is in power, and look at the danger we are facing even in the US right now of the potential return of the White House, of the climate denier, Trump, and those others. And this is really a worrying trend. So when we look at then what we need to reform and the resistance which we are going to really face, then we look at these far-fetched institutions and then the multilateralism. Is it really working? And if it is working, is it working for our interest? Who controls this multilateral institution, including even the UN we are sitting at? Who is even if we are saying, somebody has mentioned that we should not even, we should maybe support UNTAN and those others. But who again controls the UNTAN and those others? So we are in a complex world, and we really need to look at the really genuine power to drive these changes. And this, in my view, in Africa, where I come from, you see in West Africa, people are celebrating the coups, you see, everywhere. What is causing that? And what is the underlying problem? Is it the failure of these international organizations? Is it the failure of us? And why? And this is the question I was asking in the other session. Why do we have really the growth of the right-wing movement in the world? Is it the failure of even us as the civil society? Are we compliant in even driving that? And what we do now to correct that? Because I think we have, even as we have become as the civil society so elitist that even our institutions, which stood for the people in the past, our international organizations, foundations which used to really be catalysts of change in the North and in those countries, they have both been captured and perhaps by the right-wing movement. And so now we are in that crisis. So moving forward then is really mobilization and bottom up, then from below organizing. That is the only failure. But that again brings us another challenge. Do we have even trust with ourselves? Even the ones who want to drive that change. I believe that as a rule, and we really need to look at that. So my sense, as I conclude, is as we look at the challenge brought by the governments, the UN, the World Bank, and those others, we also ought to look at ourselves. Are we doing the right thing? Are we trusting each other? So I leave it there. Thank you.
Fine. Okay.
We'll do one quick round here and then get back to the policy. We're running out of time, but yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Charles Liu. I live in New York City. I'm with the United Methodist Church and the Executive Committee on the New York State Council of Churches. What I say doesn't reflect the official positions. It's my entirely personal view as a private citizen of the United States. Two things I like to talk about: the elephant in the room that we offer to talk about, and second one is about changing narrative. And there are totally unrealistic thinking, I know. It's delusional, so that's my question. Is possible? Is the question at the end of what I'm going to say. So, elephant in the country. I mean, in this room, in this discussion is, I want to look into like school ground, disruptive students, and bullies. How do we manage bullies and disruptive personalities? And the disruptive bullies in all this effort situations in the world is actually in my own country, United States of America, and other countries that follow in line with my own country. And because governments do not reflect and represent the people, but the ruling elites, part of the imperial oligarchs for all these things. So what we may need is that just like the way we try to control the police on the school ground, we do need to make the behavior of G7, OECD, and all other international, multinational institutions, institutions who controls them. So all their efforts to undermine our efforts to reform and transform, we need to let them know specifically why suddenly IMF, thank you, Bono, for your IMF reform became right disappearing, and then only World Bank and adding strange things there to confuse the pictures. All those things is really spoken and in the way common can understand to challenge their government and all those things. So that's where we do this in our own country, unfortunately. Change the narrative. We do need to change the narrative. And here I like to bring the question of the word dead. Dead in the biblical language, interchange in the word sin. So if I do wrong to you, I'm indebted to you when the restoration happens, and the relationship becomes whole again. So threats that are anti-global and predators, global north is predators, and the global south is debtors, are debtors. And thank you very much. Our effort to come out of that, put it another thing. But that whole scheme is a result of historical extractive colonialism. And current effort at alleviating those debts, using that is a continuing extraction. So everybody from the biblical perspective, those who are indebted, it is a sins the global. So when indebted nations, they know paying the debts is actually not defaulting the loan, it is actually demanding reparation for the trillions and trillions of dollars of extraction that has accumulated. We need to change narrative that way and call global north of their sins. So is it possible? I don't know. Let's go fast because I have Francis Cairo, Tax Services Network Africa. Just a short reflection, and just building up on what colleagues have mentioned. We know that part of the solution to the global financial architecture is actually, as we reform the global institutions, is to strengthen the regional mechanisms. For example, the African Development Bank, or even having credit rating agencies strengthened at that level. But we know, just a reflection, and we'll be happy to hear this from the entire panel, on the role that these global financial institutions have in actually undermining the alternatives and ensuring that they remain the apex institution, and ensuring that, for example, the regional financing mechanisms will not work, ensuring that the credit rating agencies remain the same, and ensuring that even though we are pushing for their own reform and pushing for the alternatives, it becomes even harder to achieve the alternative because they play the role of forestalling reforms, but also where we could get alternatives, ensuring that those alternatives are being undermined, and they will never work. Thank you.
One last comment from Paul, and then we come back to the podcast. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just one side comment. I feel it's your personal thing, but instead of sins, we should say crimes against humanity. Because I don't think we can use the word sin because it has been so abused. And you cannot push that language here, I feel. I agree. So it's a crime against humanity. Yeah. The second thing I'd like to say is this whole North and South that you are saying, I don't agree with you. Mainly because the countries which are in the South, their financial architecture is also as an elite countries that they do. The elite in those countries are having this architecture and they would like to link with the elite in other countries. So if you are advocating for the South and saying that, you are indicating us, I would agree because the Dalits in my country, the Quilombolas in Brazil, the Roma, Sinti, Gypsy in Europe, and several of their own citizens in their own countries, they are not accessing the financial architecture and the accessibility is not there. So I don't want to group ourselves with the elite in my country and then say, you West, you give the debt relief, because that debt relief is nothing to do with the communities that I'm representing. So if you're fighting for us... Sorry.
If you don't speak inside the microphone, the people online will not hear you.
I'm sorry.
Now you the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Oh, which is? Oh, I turned it on.
You have to put down so I think if we can bring that layer in, so that you don't group Ambani and all the millionaires and others in several of these countries and say that they are also being affected by this same financial infrastructure. I think that is my only thing. I think if we can ensure that exclusion that is taking place within each country, so-called southern countries, it's a myth. And so therefore, how do you then, when you're putting the demands, make sure that we're also speaking for the leave no one behind? Thank you.
And in the microphone.
Hi, thank you very much. Amazing presentation. Thank you. I'm Maria Rombacera from the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And very quick, 3 points, super quick, don't worry. So ODAs and a new convention on tax cooperation. And just like at the moment, we know that ODA is normally also negotiated, like they've been with the same people with corporations, and they also negotiate tax incentives at the same time. That's how I want to flag that. And the concept of ODA, we'll be talking also about reparations, so only just to flag that. When we are talking about tax haven, as the few countries that would benefit, I would also like to question that, because are really tax havens, profiting from that, or the multinational corporations and against the capital and investors? And this is particularly important when we are talking about the Caribbean countries, normally portrayed as the tax havens, although we know that the tax havens happen more in Luxembourg, in the UK, etc. But I think that this is particularly important to join forces. Again, when we are talking about joining forces, in this room, we seem to be preaching to the converting, right? So how can we really reach out other constituencies? Why are we not talking about what debt means and tax evasion, like global tax abuse really mean for human rights? What does it mean also for climate justice? What does it mean for the SDGs? How can we, the people that Jason was talking about, how can they engage in this debate, appropriate them? Like, how can we make all of these discourses a lot more accessible? So this is not something that we only discuss here in this type of events. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Apologies, but we are running out of time. So I do have to give the microphone back to the panel, but I hope stay, we can keep this conversation going. We have, of course, all of tomorrow as well. And so with that, I think maybe we can start from that end. Bodo, I know this was a lot of comments and questions, which is very, very helpful, but I'll leave it to all of you to answer the ones that you met.
Yeah, just pick a few, of course. Starting with one of duplication from Gretche. It's quite remarkable that what's happening at the World Bank and the IMF at the moment is a massive mission creep. So actually these institutions, the reform that is ongoing, I mean, the idea to make the World Bank work more on global challenges and climate change on health issues is basically moving into very crowded fields. There are a lot of other players in the field already, I mean, especially UN organizations. And the reason, of course, why some countries want the World Bank to do that is because there's better control of the World Bank than on the other organizations. But this is a weird, I mean, there's actually no need necessarily for the World Bank to become stronger in this issue. Yet the same with the IMF is the new facility, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, where the IMF now becomes a climate lender. There are 24 multilateral funds already for climate lending. So actually no one needs the IMF really in that field. Yeah, on the quota reform issue, I mean, indeed, I mean, the original problem is the $1 one vote system. I mean, what the quota reforms are doing is just that they try to adjust the quota, I mean, the voting rights to changing realities. I mean, that some countries got economically stronger and the quotas need to be adjusted, but this doesn't address the problem.
dynamics there as well. But I think it's important to recognize that the reforms that we're calling for, this panel was discussing, changes that we want to see at the international level. Those are not mutually exclusive from reforms that we also need to undertake at the national level, right? And so, for example, when we talk about tax, this conversation was about the international financial architecture, the African group proposal, etc. But even at national level, right, there are changes we need to do to also address some of the issues that, for example, our elites are perpetuating, right? But what is important, and I'm not sure that another study has been done in other regions, but at least within the African context, when you take a look at who is most responsible, right, for the loss of revenue within our countries, it's multinational corporations. This is not to say that there is no role for corruption, yes, but there is a significantly larger negative impact that's happening as a result of MNCs and high net worth individuals. So just wanted to make that point.
All right. I think I would address the point about, all these talk about change or reform at the international level. Oftentimes, the reforms just instrumentalizing it, but to serve the status quo. And there is no change happening. And that is a reality that we have to face and we have to keep on exposing. The reality also that inequalities, whether at the international level in terms of relations between countries, between the North and the South, and at the country level, where the elites are in power and perpetuating their power by conniving with the international powers that be. These are realities that we also have to fight. And I think this underscores the need that at the country level, we have to strengthen people's organizations and social movements who can actually expose what is happening at their level, whether at the communities or at the national level, and also present their own solutions to the problems that they are facing, which are oftentimes ignored by the elite that are in power. And so as CSOs,
the solidarity, I think there is much need for us to support those at the working at the grassroots level, those who are organizing workers, who are helping different communities fight landlessness, those who are fighting with environmental defenders and indigenous people at the community level to claim their rights, and to also be able to assert their demands on democratizing the economy. These are ways to achieve the sovereignty of other people for real development, social development. So we are not really placing ourselves in the UN that you asked about us. Are we, what the UN represents?
They are the governments who are in charge, of the politics and the economy of countries. And so we are also putting them accountable for what is happening, whether at the country or the international level. And they have that accountability to us, the people. They are answerable to us. And we should always demand their full accountability. So I think that's the crux of the matter, the strengthening at the country level. And then we need international solidarity so that collectively we can demand our governments to address the real needs of the people.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the comments and the questions. I think I'll try not to repeat what has been said, but maybe start with the legitimacy of why we're gathered here and why sometimes it might seem that we're preaching to the converted. The legitimacy of our movement starts in this room when we are all on the same page, when we are all singing off the same hymn sheet. It means that there is a level of solidarity that exists in this room, you know, because we're all from very diverse backgrounds, diverse regions, and have very different value systems. But the fact that we can use this room to coalesce on specific issues allows us then to go out onto the streets and across the road and present these demands and to present our issues in a coherent and coordinated manner. I think two additional points that are worth mentioning. The point that Francis was making on strengthening regional institutions. I think whilst important, it is very important. It is equally important to appreciate that the tranquilizer approach that Joab referred to and some of the points that Jane referred to, in who is actually deciding to strengthen these institutions. To what extent do, in the context of Africa, for example, to what extent do the member states on the continent have the resource, the political will, and also the direction to strengthen these institutions becomes very important. We hail the continental free trade area, but yet it is yet another permutation of a neoliberal agenda, which is to open up the continent to foreign investment and foreign takeover of industry. The tranquilizer approach is to slow down the momentum that many of our African leaders had gathered during the COVID-19 period, when they were very vocal about the health architecture, they were very vocal about the trade architecture and the financial architecture. And now we're being given small piecemeal deals through this divide and conquer to slow down that momentum. And so we must be very careful and very cognizant of these different approaches that countries in the developed world are using to try and slow down that momentum. And lastly, I think the point that was being made on the shifting geopolitical, I think, yes, it's true, there is shifting geopolitical, but also countries in the global, in developing countries have taken their own strategies in the geopolitical movement and addressed and aligned themselves accordingly. That maybe 10, 15 years ago, this might not have been the case. There has been that shift in positioning on geopolitical developments that are taking place internationally. And we must then use that as a potential way to then push our agenda in the forefront of those geopolitical movements, and how then do we maximize if we want to get the kind of reform agenda of the international financial architecture that we're looking for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the very good comments coming in. I just have two comments. One is to be able to realize the fact that the global system is broken. That comes up on tested. And what I have realized is that the global institutions are reinventing themselves to remain relevant. And I have seen this in the WTO. The World Trade Organization bringing on gender. They even came up with a very strong statement on gender. But if you don't know what you want, then you follow whatever anything which is put on table. And I remember a number of organizations came up and said, no, this is big watching that WTO. So the issue of the narrative, what you were raising, is very, very important. Know what we want, what we stand for, based on where we are coming from, based on our challenges, based on our history, based on our values, based on our philosophy. We need to be able to have that common narrative. And that's the only way we can be able to navigate all these mushrooming processes. Those processes of the painkillers will be there. And if we are to avoid those pitfalls, then we need to know what we stand for, what we want. And if we know that, we can be able to point out the gaps in those processes of the painkillers. And we can also be able to know
the narratives which are wrong, whether washing or now like climate change is on. There's a lot of great greenwashing, very bad policies. So we need to be clear about the narrative. That issue of actually the issue over the differentiation. It's true. There is no global south, there is no global north. But that's why when you look at the policies we put in place at the national, regional level, they are bad. Most of them, they work for the transnational because within our countries and our regions, we have those elites, who work for the multinational. We call them the comprador class. They are there. So the issue, if we are to strengthen our struggle, we are not saying the West or the East. Because even in the West, there are people who don't have access to what because of the multinationals, access to education. So the injustices are everywhere. So our struggle should be for the people on the planet. Those who stand for the people on the planet, those who stand for profit. Then we can have that clear cut. Thank you so much.
A huge round of applause for this panel. Very, very warm thank you for all those insights. Thank you for all the amazing questions. Impossible to summarize this very rich discussion. But of course, just to say that we continue the struggle on reforming the international financial and trade architecture in the United Nations. This is not mutually exclusive from the struggles that exist at the national level and the inequalities and the intersectional inequalities that we're trying to address. But of course, when we talk about inequalities between countries, we do have to come to the United Nations. And that's why we're here on the sidelines of the General Assembly to demand accountability for global North and the historical asymmetries that have existed between the North and South, and to make sure that this doesn't undermine the national struggles. And I think that's why we have this conversation on reforming the international financial architecture, that it doesn't undermine those struggles at the national level. So thank you all so much, and we look forward to staying in touch. And I hope you all have the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam.